rooms. There are not few people here, but I hope many more people will follow this discussion on screen. I introduce now Jeroen Bruggeman, who is a sociologist at the University of Amsterdam, and who does work in the theories of social evolution, and that's where he will talk about. Please, Jeroen.
Thank you. Just for the record, when Goudsblom taught big history for the very first time, I was in that class. Okay, but now cooperation. So if you look at the number of hits that you get on Google Scholar when you type in cooperation, you get over 4 million. And many of these studies, they are specialized in one or few mechanisms or principles, if you wish. Oftentimes these models, they are very technical, or there are laboratory studies, and rarely anyone asks how the results match with historical findings. So I want to make a next step and will argue that there is not one or few mechanisms that are the most important, but I will argue that there are actually 5 principles that in synergy can explain cooperation in many different situations, not all situations, of course. I will also say a few things how these mechanisms play out through history. I do this very briefly, but in my book, my forthcoming book, I do this at length. And I will say a few things about the mathematical model and some empirical findings of the predictions of this model. So, in my view, cooperation is concentrated around information. So in dyadic interactions, you have to know with whom you might cooperate and whom you should avoid. And for collective action, you have to know whom to incorporate in your group and whom to exclude, or perhaps whom to punish. So how would you get this information? Well, if you are a monkey or an ape, you would look around how other monkeys and apes behave, and you would have your experience from your personal interactions. And this is exactly what apes and monkeys do. But humans, they can gossip because they speak language, so they have an enormously larger social circle where they can recruit potential cooperating partners. Now, how does this gossip spread around in a group of people? Well, then we get to the next principle, namely the network. And not any network will do, because people can also lie and try to manipulate, or there are misunderstandings in the gossip. So in fact, if you remember Zimmel's triad, you see that there is a redundancy in the network. So in between each pair of individuals, there's a direct connection, but also an indirect connection through somebody else. So this notion you can generalize. And mathematically speaking, you have to look at the second smallest eigenvalue of the Laplacian matrix, and that informs you how much redundancy there is in the network. Okay, so then if gossip arrives at somebody, how should this person react? So somebody may become very upset, or somebody else may completely ignore the gossip. And in order to balance the reactions to gossip, it's very important that there are social norms. And there are general norms, for example, do no harm to somebody who once helped you, but there are also many situation-specific norms. So if people cooperate in a scientific project, they have different norms of cooperation than if they go on a hunting party to catch a giant sloth, as we heard before the break in this room. In order for people to use these norms effectively, they should internalize, should first be socialized in these norms and then internalize them. So then we get to the fourth principle, namely that humans should have a pro-social psychology. I'm not saying that everybody has this psychology, but if almost nobody has, then there will not be, it will not be possible to cooperate, certainly not in a longer term perspective. So in this human psychology used for cooperation, there is of course a language that they need for gossip and reputations, but also empathy. People can sense what other people's needs are and what they feel. And people can have a big memory to remember all this detailed information about lots of other people. And last but certainly not least, emotions are very important because people react to gossip they receive and things that they see around them emotionally. So they have emotions that nudge them towards cooperation and steer them away from defection. And again, this is not for everybody the same, but usually people are socialized in a way that their emotional triggers are conducive to cooperation. Well, then, if they manage to realize these first four principles, they can also, in many situations, but not all, have benefits that exceed their costs. So you may also say that benefits exceeding cost is a boundary condition because it's in the longer run simply not sustainable to cooperate if benefits are smaller than the costs. Well, my claim is that if these 5 principles are not, if any of them you would leave out, cooperation in the longer run is simply not sustainable. Now I will make some brief remarks on forager and farmer and industrial societies. This is actually almost a caricature of my book because I can say and have said a lot more about it, but just for the sake of time. So the main things that I will say a few things about is what also other people have said, that through history the scale of collective action increased and also the scope of dyadic interactions increased. And there is, over history, a change of institutions, of course. Well, if we start out with the structure of forager society, we see that there are levels of nestedness where smaller groups are nested in larger groups. So in a camp group, there are 4 to 5 families. Camp groups, they are between 10 and 25 people. So they have an advantage in having more people because then they can search for more food and help one another if somebody does not manage to find enough food in a day. But the downside is the more people there are, the stronger the competition for the food. So when the effect of competition eclipses the effect of the positive effect of information exchange and helping each other out, then if the group becomes larger, then some people have to hive off. Well, the next level is then you may call occasional groups. So, for example, a winter camp where multiple smaller camp groups come together, and then we speak about 150 to roughly 180 people. So the scale of of collective action for foragers is roughly, say, maximally 200 people or so. Early on, when people tried to explain cooperation, one of the first mechanisms proposed was genetic relatedness, but this actually only works in very small families. So then you talk about 4 or 5 people who, on the basis of close relatedness, can cooperate with each other. And that leaves almost all of the cooperation among foragers unexplained. So you could say that this is a 6th general principle, but the scope of this principle is really very limited, and the scale thereof. So therefore I speak of these 5 much more general principles. All of you know, of course, that foragers had no leaders who could force them to do things against their will, so all this cooperation among them was without leaders, and that's one of the advantages of the 5 principles. Now we jump to farmer societies, a huge leap in history, so apologies for the culture shock, but now we have a similar structure, but a very different society. One of the big differences is that there is not only an embedding of smaller groups in larger groups, but now there is also social inequality. So there are all kinds of Putins and Zelenskys who want to be in charge of everybody else. And we now have households that are perhaps in villages, or they are in neighborhoods in cities. And these are then in city-states, or perhaps in larger units, such as even empires. So the scale of collective action also increased, because once there are leaders, they and their military help can much more easily coordinate the cooperation of multiple smaller units, who may not even be very much aware what the other units are doing, but they can be more easily cowed into submission and forced to do things perhaps even against their will. So in irrigation and also in military actions, there was a huge increase of scale of collective action. There was also a big increase in the scope of potential dyadic interactions through trade networks and other larger networks than foragers had. It also happened, of course, that sometimes people in or even larger groups that were not in the same hierarchical structure wanted to cooperate with each other. And that was really quite difficult. So Bram de Zwaan, he has interesting examples of medieval Europe, where poor people were roaming around. They then had to be fed if they became too annoying. And then they would all go to the communities where most food was given. So they would kind of, the poorer communities, they would free ride on the wealthier communities. And this then took many centuries to finally solve in the modern welfare states as we now know them. But once you stay within a hierarchical structure, then it is much easier. How am I doing on time?
We have 5 minutes, let's say.
5 minutes, okay. 6 minutes.
Or more. Somewhat more, even.
Somewhat more, even. Thanks. Okay. I think what I skip is that there are also big institutional changes, for example, religion. I just briefly mentioned that with the entry of moralistic religions, this also affected all these 5 principles. So there were new norms for regulating reputations, such as certain taboos that have to be obeyed, certain practices that have to be done. People's psychology changed for a bit because they reacted differently to certain disobediences. And the networks changed because people could do large rituals in large groups, in much larger groups than foragers did. Just as an example to point out that there were large institutional changes. The industrial society continued to increase the scale and scope of cooperation. First bureaucracy and nowadays the internet had an effect on reputations that could be made and also very easily lost online. And then, because we are in the evolutionary section here, I will make a few remarks on on cooperation and evolution. And now I can already link to the next presentation. I don't know what it exactly will be, but it is about different time scales of evolution. And in this context, it's interesting to see that our psychology, at least our dispositions to have emotions and cognition, they are genetically inherited. So this changes in a very long time perspective. And all the emotions that we and that we can have, they are very much the same as other social mammals and social and perhaps also animals of other species have, at least according to neuroscientists. So this changes very slowly. And then at a faster pace, there is evolution of our institutions and norms. And at a really fast pace, there is evolution of gossip. So if you look at one imaginary gossip, it is a combination of words and phrases in a language. So there is the combinational aspect there. Then it's being transmitted to people around the gossipee. So gossips do not sexually reproduce, of course, but there is transmission. Subsequently, they are being used by people to update the reputations that they have of the gossipee, or they discard the gossip. So there's the selection, so there's positive selection of updating reputations, or negative selection of discarding the gossip. And then once this all happens, it changes the social environment locally around the gossipee, where people have updated their reputations based on these gossips. So on a very small scale, and usually quite rapidly, certainly compared with the other evolutionary paces, there is a gossip evolution. How many minutes would I have to say?
You have still a few minutes.
A few minutes. Okay, then I briefly illustrate a few things of the mathematical model. It's a general model of collective action. But here I show, well, let me talk about one application which is based on empirical data. So if you watch street fights going on of groups of young men fighting other groups of young men, you see two kinds of patterns. Sometimes the group bursts into fighting, where most people at the same moment start fighting against the others, versus groups where instead of a burst there is more of a sizzle. So some people, in a more asynchronous way, they throw a few punches, and that's about it. And if you classify, so these are based on a video recorded street fights that have been coded in minute detail by Don Wenig and his assistants. And on the left you have these sizzles, and on the right hand you have the bursts. Well, what the model does, based on statistical physics, it has as input a network, so it does not need all the 5 principles, but it has at least the network. It can also incorporate other principles, but not in this case. And it has the very simple distinction: people can either cooperate or they can defect. That's all. So there are no gradings in how much they cooperate. And basis of this model, it predicts the proportion of defectors, so how many defectors there are in a group that prevents a burst to break out. And it's exactly 1/3, that's the red line. So the red line is the prediction of the model, and as you see, it's also the best separation of the burst and the fizzles. Shall I say something about the
Yes,
other image?
please.
Okay. The model predicts for the bursts that over time, running from left to right, at a certain moment there will be a very sudden and rapid increase of the amount of cooperation, which on the right-hand picture is the vertical axis. So that's the baseline model. And then the blue dotted line shows that if you let people, so these artificial agents in the model, be informed by gossip which is noisy, so that their information is not perfectly okay anymore, but there is some portion of noise in it, of misunderstandings or manipulations, then a cooperation starts much earlier, but it has relapses because it is also very often being perturbed through the noise in the gossip. Well, it's a fairly new model. These are just the first results that came out, and for sure it will have other possibilities for future studies. So as a wrap-up, in one sentence, this is the summary. So you can, the 5 principles, you can rephrase them such they all start with an R, so then you can call it the 5R package. And in my forthcoming book, there is a lot more about these and many other things.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. Who would like to comment, ask questions? Yes. Steije.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeroen. I had one question. Did you also look at the importance of cultural symbols, like Durkheim and the totem? So you said common cultural symbols are extremely important for cooperation.
No, I didn't. So what else can I say?
Okay.
Should I do it now?
Yeah, but do you think they are important to sort of venerate a common symbol like a totem or a flag, and that this may stimulate human cooperation?
Well, there are many things that do not really explain cooperation from an evolutionary point of view, and this would be one of them, because if all you guys would believe in a symbol, I would think, well, then I'm going to free ride on you, because you will cooperate on the basis of your belief in the symbol, and then I stay home, and once you're done with your cooperation, I come back to benefit from your public good. So from an evolutionary point of view, this would be selected out very quickly, unless there would be norms attached to these symbols, such that I would be punished for not believing in the symbol.
You would be selected out, not us.
It entirely depends. Okay. So.
I think I want to ask a similar question. In a conference that I organized in 1984, there was the world historian William H. McNeill in a discussion with Norbert Elias and Immanuel Wallerstein, and asked about his definition of civilization. He emphasized sacred texts. Harari, in his brief history of humankind, emphasizes the importance of what he calls, I've read only the German translation, so I don't know what is the keyword that he uses in the English or Hebrew original. Essentially, one of his main theses is that human beings cooperate in large numbers on the basis of the belief in fictitious narrations, in fictions, great fictions or grand narratives. If you connect this to the idea of William H. McNeill, that civilizations are built upon sacred texts, which of course are written versions of these grand fictitious narratives. So I would ask you about the place that you would give these fictitious narratives which enable strangers, as McNeill said, to cooperate, for example, within trade networks that extend across ethnic groupings or local groupings.
Thank
Okay, so that's quite easy. So in a mathematical model, I can attribute different values to cooperation and defection. And then if people believe in sacred text, they would imagine that the cost will be lower and the potential benefits would be higher. So a sordid war becomes a sacred war. And then everybody becomes very enthusiastic to fight in that war. So that's not difficult at all to incorporate in the model. The other thing is these trade networks. Well, the examples that I know, for example, by Greif, I don't know how to pronounce the English English name, but he mentions that there are always overarching institutions. So different people who don't know each other, they can cooperate knowing that they will be observed by other people who all believe or apply the same institution, so that in the end of the day they would be punished if they cheat. And if this is not at all the case, then it would be rather difficult. But nevertheless, they can cooperate to some extent if they... so if complete strangers without overarching structure meet each other, they can start with small gifts. And as Salins said, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. So that could be a wonderful start of a cooperation. But it would be very vulnerable, like all dyadic cooperation that is not embedded in a network. So my claim would be that in general, this would be risky and short-lived, and for cooperation to continue, also dyadic cooperation, the dyadic tie should be embedded in a larger structure where these 5 principles apply. And therefore, you also see most of the cooperation within groups and much less so across groups. So modern society with global institutions that foster and sustain a global trade, that's really new in history, of course.
One more question, perhaps? Okay, thank you very much, Jeroen. I will give now the floor to Steije Hofhuis, who is an historian. He studied history at the University of Amsterdam, but now he is related to Utrecht University, and he tries in his work to synthesize history with evolutionary Darwinian theory. So he will talk about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nico, for the introduction. Yeah, my dissertation is sort of finished, and it focuses on European witch persecutions, especially in Germany. And I look at those persecutions from a Darwinian angle. Yeah, so Darwinian theory and history, that's sort of my specialization. Well, first a few words on how I learned about Johan Goudsblom. As Nico said, I studied history here at the University of Amsterdam. And historians here are very much focused on very specific historical phenomena and studying them within their own specific context, which I liked. But at the same time, as a student, I was very much interested in biology, evolution, social theory, sort of the bigger picture, and I wanted to combine those things. And the historians here were not really into that, but fortunately at the University of Amsterdam there was an amazing course named Big History, which I found extremely inspiring. And there is the sociology department, and I learned to know people there who are interested in these topics, so that was wonderful. Goudsblom was already retired at the time, but to a certain extent I think this was also his legacy. And I also learned about his work, which is full of the things that I wanted to explore. Not using the right button, yeah. Yeah, and here, for instance, is a quote that I found in one of his books. I've translated it myself. Time and again, we have to deal with interactions between unpredictable mutations and yet explainable selection. This goes for individual learning, biological evolution, as well as sociocultural development. So he's also interested in drawing comparisons between biological and sociocultural processes, but he also points at many hazards of such comparisons. Yeah, so that's what I want to talk about, the problems and prospects of Darwinian theory in the social sciences and the humanities. Here's another person that I drew a lot of inspiration from, Daniel Dennett. He sees Darwinian theory as a universal acid that will eat through any barrier it encounters. He, for instance, wrote, life and all its glories are thus united under a single perspective. So he thinks that the idea of a blind Darwinian evolution leading to adaptations is very productive. He often calls it design without designer. But such grandiloquent claims have also met a lot of criticisms. There are a few quotes, for instance, critics who said, evolution is one kind of change, history is another. And someone else said, it's old wine, new bottles. So these Darwinian claims, it's just a redescription of things that we knew all along. So it raises the question, what are the prospects? Can Darwinian theory help us better understand human history? And I think to assess this question, it is important to distinguish various tempos of Darwinian evolution and also various explanatory levels. And the idea of history occurring at various speeds, of course, isn't new. Very famous French historian who looked at it that way is Fernand Braudel, plural temporality. He distinguished slow speed history of the long term, the longue durée, like, for instance, interactions between humans, societies, and their natural environment. Medium speed, cyclical and conjunctural history, like economic booms and busts. And high speed, the history of events, what historians traditionally studied. But I think we can also discern a plural temporality in a Darwinian sense. And I think three speeds can be distinguished. Very slow speed, the idea of a Stone Age mind from a EEA, that's the first thing I will talk about. Medium speed, the idea of gene-culture co-evolution, and high speed, Darwinian cultural evolution. So first, the idea of a Stone Age mind from a so-called environment of evolutionary adaptedness. This idea was especially developed by the field of evolutionary psychology as it came of age, especially in the 1990s. And it argues that all organisms, humans included, biologically adapt to their environments. And biological evolution is supposed to be a very, very slow process. So our minds and bodies are adapted to the environment in which we mostly evolved, the African savanna, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. So we still house a Stone Age mind, it is argued. So, for instance, we like fat and sweet food, and we're afraid of spiders and snakes, but not because that's adaptive in our current environment, but because it was adaptive in this environment. And also, supposedly, there was a division of labor between the sexes that would still leave its mark on our biological makeup today and would explain certain differences between the sexes. And the idea is that all humans in all societies share these traits. It concerns a universal human nature. Here are two key exponents, John Tooby and Lida Cosmides. They were also a couple. For instance, one of their papers is called "The Past Explains the Present, Emotional Adaptations and the Structure of Ancestral Environments." But as many of you probably know, this field has also been very much criticized. It's said that it's full of just so stories. It lacks solid evidence. And this is a complicated discussion in its own right that I won't go into. I think some of the criticisms are warranted, others are too harsh. But I very much agree with an observation by an historian, Daniel Lord Smale, who wrote, "Evolutionary psychology is naturally ahistorical and would resist the best efforts of even a sympathetically minded historian." And I agree, because historians, like many sociologists and cultural anthropologists, are especially interested in sociocultural change. Why are societies different and what makes them different? And evolutionary psychology cannot really tell us how that happens, because it's just the same mind in all societies. So, for instance, in my research, I was interested why from 1560 onwards did Europeans start hunting witches at an unprecedented scale? Well, evolutionary psychology can't tell us, because people still had the same minds. It pays little attention to cultural complexity. So let's move to medium speed, the idea of gene-culture co-evolution, which does devote a lot of attention to culture. Well, the idea of co-evolution is a concept of evolutionary biology, and it concerns the idea that species are adapted to each other, like the flowers and the bees. And in this case, they even came to depend on each other. And the idea of gene-culture co-evolution is that humans and culture are also thoroughly adapted to each other and came to depend on each other. Because culture became part of the environment and humans in a biological way adapted to this environment. So for instance, our minds have become extremely good at absorbing and learning languages. So we evolved, biologically speaking, into a thoroughly cultural species. There are many examples of gene-culture co-evolution. Goudsblom conference, I should mention fire. So cooking caused the evolution of smaller teeth, jaws, mouths, guts, and vice versa, because food was softened through the heat of fire, so it was easier to digest for a body. So all these things were not that much needed anymore. In this case, it still concerns a universal trait that is shared by humans across all societies, but there are also claims about gene-culture co-evolution that may explain differences between various populations. For instance, lactose tolerance, which it is argued resulted from the cultural practice of dairy farming, which caused increased lactose tolerance, and vice versa. Because in societies with high lactose tolerance, it usually concerns societies that have a long history of dairy farming. So here it becomes something historical, and evolution is moving at a higher speed. I think it's an interesting idea, but I always warn people at the same time for this theory, because it can take a thorny, very tricky twist. Because some people argue that gene-culture co-evolution can also lead to biological changes within hundreds of years, and also concern cognitive and behavioral changes. And one example of such a theory is the Ashkenazi intelligence hypothesis by two authors, Bruggeman and Harpending. And they argue, we propose that the Ashkenazi Jews have a genetic advantage in intelligence that arose from natural selection for success in white-collar occupations during their sojourn in Northern Europe. So they argue for centuries, Ashkenazi Jews lived in a niche full of high cognitive, of professions full of high cognitive demands, and survival in that niche dependent more than in other niches on intelligence. So that would explain why Ashkenazi Jews became sort of biologically more intelligent than other groups. One author who jumped on the bandwagon of this idea was Nicholas Wade, a former New York Times science reporter, who wrote recently a book, A Troublesome Inheritance. For instance, reflects on why Africa remains poor. He said perhaps it's related to variations in their nature, such as time preference, work ethic, and propensity to violence. And he proposes a lot of theories like this. For instance, why doesn't democracy work in the Middle East? Well, because those people are biologically adapted to their tribal cultural environment. Yeah, as you probably understand, many experts strongly resist such ideas. Here's David Reich, a geneticist from Harvard University, who wrote, "Unfortunately, today there is a new breed of writers and scholars who argue not only that there are average genetic differences, but that they can guess what they are based on traditional racial stereotypes." And these theories are entirely speculative. So the idea of gene-culture co-evolution lends itself for racist abuse. But what's perhaps even more concerning, Reich also writes, even if we do not yet know what the differences are, we should prepare our science and society to be able to deal with the reality of differences instead of sticking our heads in the sand and pretending that differences cannot be discovered. He argues that our knowledge of genetic differences is advancing, and we can't really be sure that none of it happened. So if true, gene-culture co-evolution occurred at a much higher speed and may have had historical consequences. But I must say, as a cultural historian, I'm focused on the impact of culture, and it makes me highly skeptical of such theories, and of course it's hazardous territory. But still, even if some of those gene-culture coevolution processes occurred, I think there's a lot about history that this won't teach us anything about. For instance, my question about witch hunting. So now let's move to high-speed evolution, namely Darwinian cultural evolution. That's a growing field, and the basic idea is that culture undergoes processes of variation, selection, and reproduction, resulting in cultural adaptations. So forms of culture adapt to their environments. And we might think of environments as the ecological environments, or perhaps the structures of our brains, or the cultural environment. So in a sense, one could call it culture-culture coevolution. Here, for instance, is a key book from this field with the subtitle, How Darwinian Theory Can Explain Human Culture and Synthesize the Sciences. Many of the studies in this field still focus on long-term processes. A famous study is The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage. Tries to explain why the cultural practice of monogamy replaced the cultural practice of polygamy. The authors write, the norms and institutions that compose the modern package of monogamous marriage have been favored by cultural evolution because of their group beneficial effects, promoting success in intergroup competition. Because as they argued, a monogamy creates more social stability because there are less men without wives who become resentful and become a destabilizing factor in society. There are more long-term studies like the evolution of food taboos or anthropomorphic gods who punish behavior. But some studies also study more short-term processes. Like, for instance, a study by biologist David Slow Wilson on the evolution of Calvinism from the 16th century onwards. Because Darwinian cultural evolution can move more quickly. And there it becomes all the more relevant, I would say, also for historians. And this is the kind of Darwinian evolution that I made use of in my research on European witch persecutions. Because I focused on the evolution of early modern European witch beliefs and persecutions. As historians already noted, many ideas and practices of late medieval Europe evolved into what is often called a cumulative concept of witchcraft. And it concerned the idea that the devil made a pact with people, especially women, through sexual intercourse. He then gave them magical powers to cause great harm, for instance, destroying harvest through influencing weather conditions. Witches met each other at ghastly nightly gatherings, witches' sabbats. And also the devil was present there. And witches could fly to the Sabbath, for instance, on an enchanted broomstick. And it was widely thought that torture was a good way to find out who the witches were. And concepts of witchcraft continually adapted to specific circumstances and also became very well adapted to create new and large witch persecutions. So, for instance, if something bad happened, like a failed harvest due to a hailstorm, people might suspect witchcraft. And if they believed to have found one witch, they would start torturing this person to make him or her confess who else they had seen at the witches' Sabbath, because witches were supposed to know each other. So you could get whole chains of accusations that could also spread over long distances because of the belief in nightly flight. So it was a very explosive cluster of beliefs. And in my research, I framed this in a Darwinian way, as the evolution of cultural information, with some cultural variants outcompeting others. But one might, of course, wonder, why is this helpful? As two critics of the field of cultural evolution wrote, what explanatory work is done by claiming that culture evolves? But I do think it has added values, and I especially focused on two elements. One is the question, how does culture adapt? And a possible answer delivered by this field is that it happens partially through Darwinian cultural evolution, a design without designer. So not all cultural adaptations result from human intentions and recognition. Quite often it's accidentally adaptive variants that are cumulatively preserved. The second issue is, what is culture adapted for? And one proposal made within this field is self-reproduction. Culture can reproduce sort of selfishly in a pathogen-like way. So forms of culture may sometimes spread at the expense of their human hosts, like viruses. And I looked at witch persecutions from these angles. So I wondered, was the cumulative concept of witchcraft to a certain extent a cultural design without designer? Because in the past, many historians thought that this whole cumulative concept was intelligently designed by people for specific purposes. For instance, inquisitors or city elites designed it shrewdly. But historians already concluded that this was not really the case. There was no central planning, and people often just genuinely started panicking about witches. So I examined a Darwinian scenario in which this concept assembled through blind Darwinian evolution. And was the cumulative concept of witchcraft to a certain extent a cultural pathogen spreading at the expense of its human hosts? Because historians already compared witch hunts very often to epidemic diseases, because there were outbreaks of witch hunting, contagion with one village infecting another village, and many casualties as a result. But I've wondered, are these similarities perhaps more than trivial? Are there underlying similar processes? And I've had an empirical look at this. I'll highlight two things. I, for instance, looked at cultural variants that did not make it, that did not successfully survive. Here, for instance, is a terrifying report from a trial in Derenburg, witch trial 1555. It tells about witches who were put at the stake, but then a demon saved them from the fire before they were burned. And the witches came back afterwards, set a house on fire, and killed a person. And this is a cultural variant about witchcraft that did not reproduce. And I think it's also understandable because if you believe that it's pointless to burn a witch because they will be saved anyway and are still dangerous, I mean, it's also pointless to hunt witches. So this idea did not boost the reproduction of witch hunting. So it didn't make it, in contrast, for instance, to the belief in Sabbats. And there's also something very interesting about witches' Sabbats, because people started to believe in larger witches' Sabbats. And this had the effect that the witch hunts also became much larger. Because if you believe that Sabbats are mass events, you potentially get witch hunts that kill hundreds of people. And that is precisely what happened around 1626. So beliefs about witchcraft evolved in a manner that boosted the reproduction of witch hunting's own reproduction. And I've studied loads of sources from this time period, and my conclusion is that it did not really evolve this way because people at the time understood this mechanism, or because these people themselves benefited from these huge persecutions. My proposal is that it was a form of blind evolution, with some variants that were just accidentally adapted to create larger persecutions and survived because of that effect. So in conclusion, I proposed three explanatory levels, or three speeds of Darwinian evolution. And the latter model of Darwinian evolution, at least for me as a historian, I would say is the most auspicious one. And one can study specific historical processes within a larger framework, thus uniting sort of the nomothetic, the general, or the bigger picture, with the ideographic, with studying very specific things. Okay, there is already a paper on my witch persecution research, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Steije, for this, for your presenting these challenging ideas. Who would like to comment? Yes, Gieselinde.
Yes.
I give you the microphone.
Oh, it's for the people at home.
It's for the people. Okay.
Yeah.
For the mensen thuis. Okay. So yeah, I have two questions. I think the interesting thing about cultural evolution, of course, is the question what the unit of analysis is. So how do you see this? And I think typically the answer tends to be something like a meme or a smaller thing. And I think there is somewhat of a contradiction there, because I think most cultural theorists tend to think of culture as a system. So how do you see this? So what sort of model of culture would sort of work with that from cultural history or maybe sociology or other cultural sciences? And what's the unit of analysis for you? Or the
I think this
units
is
that
one of
get
the
selected?
most important questions. Yeah, because I derived the idea of sort of a culture reproducing selfishly from Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Susan Blackmore. And they use the term meme, but I try to avoid that term because I think it's unfortunate. You can't chop culture into sort of separate elements. So Peter Richardson and Robert Boyd, two other important persons from this field, they use cultural variant as a term, which is more flexible. So I prefer cultural variant. So I would say it's eventually it's the selection of cultural information. Some cultural information reproduces better than other cultural information. For instance, the information that witches come back, or that are saved from the fire and come back afterwards. It's a cultural variant. It's cultural information that did not reproduce successfully. Whereas the information that witches assemble at huge witches' sabbats, that reproduced very successfully.
Okay, so if I may, a follow-up question. Yeah, I am. So I know this work, and I think indeed this is a more promising approach. But then it's still, I mean, it sits sort of uncomfortably with the sort of more holistic understandings that most cultural theorists tend to have. Like a culture is sort of not even variance, but more like a unit of things that really stick together in a much more. You don't believe in that?
Oh,
or how
I
do you
totally
combine
believe in
it?
that.
Or, yeah.
I think societies or sociocultural systems are extremely important. So what cultural information survives very strongly depends on the cultural environment. So for instance, the idea of witchcraft was of course part of a broader cultural context in which it was quite plausible to kill heretics. And to be afraid of the devil, and to be afraid of uncontrollable female sexuality. So it was very much part of a cultural context. It could not have functioned without the context. But all elements of the context are also subject to, I would say, processes of selection. Yeah, and they're all mutually adapted to each other. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I have two questions. First, I do not see clearly what is the relationship between your reference to Fernand Braudel and to Darwin. Would you like to combine the two theories, or what is the relationship between the approaches represented by Braudel and that of Darwin? Second point, you have referred to witchcraft, okay, but how can you refer to witchcraft without mentioning the gender order and without taking into account the role of masculine domination? And if you would like to take this dimension into account, how could you put into your model the issue of the transformation of the gender order?
Well, I think that the gender dimension is extremely important because probably somewhere around 75% or even 80% of the people burned as witches consisted of women. So I would say it's a cultural concept that was adapted to its environment, and the environment in this period, the 15th and 16th, 17th century, was full of misogyny and stereotypes about women. So the concept very much adapted to this context. So for instance, the idea that the devil had sex with women, I think was very well adapted to the deepest fears of this time period. Because people were terribly afraid of the devil. Uncontrollable female sexuality was a problem. So by combining those two things, the concept evolved into something very inflammable, something that people really wanted to crush. But some people argue that it was sort of the witch hunting system was a shrewd design, and it was designed to oppress women. But many historians have abandoned that interpretation, and I think it's correct, because there was still quite a significant minority of the victims consisted of men, and it doesn't take seriously enough the magical religious worldview at the time. Many historians concluded that people were just genuinely afraid of witchcraft. It was not some sort of means towards a hidden end. They were just really panicking. And you also had this interesting question about...
First one,
yeah,
the relationship between Brodel and Darwin.
I just wanted
In
to
your,
say that, of course, there are many ideas about history occurring at various speeds. But Brodel belongs to the Anal school, and I find this very stimulating school of thought. Because they often presume that culture is very robust. So individuals come and go. They were pretty much inspired by Durkheim. So individuals come and go, but certain social structures persist. So I think one can also look at that in a Darwinian way. So some structures reproduce, like genetic information that's reproduced, even if individuals come and go. So I do see certain links between arguments made by the Anal school and Darwinian theory.
But you simply would have wanted to suggest that in the science of history, there is a legitimate approach which takes into account the tempo and the plurality of the plurality or plural temporality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
well, that's
exactly.
you would have wanted to suggest finally.
Yeah.
Another question. Yes.
I did not understand well.
Oh, there's a microphone.
I didn't understand well your argument about an interaction between genetic evolution and cultural evolution. One idea, I mean, I for a long time I have also thought about this role of culture. But culture is nowadays usually thought as something that is very fluid and very variable. I have long resisted the idea to use the concept of discourse. I had many reservations about it. But recently I have come into more contact with biographical research because my wife is very much engaged in this over the last decades and in Germany in sociological biographical research. And the interesting thing is that in her empirical work and of her associates, it emerges that something like that could be represented by the term discourse seems to have a very important role in the structuring of biographies, especially if you understand that biographies are also intertwined with, narratives about biographies. How people experience their lives is dependent on the narratives that they believe in, and these narratives interact with collective discourses. Mm-hmm. So a change of the hegemonial collective discourse will cause re-evaluations of your own biography. So the question is, do you have any idea how a concept like discourse could be used in the analysis and explanation of these conjuncture, long-term success of witch hunting?
Okay, thank you.
I do sympathize with the idea of discourse to a certain extent, because discourses are also being reproduced. There are constantly new variants. Some survive, others don't. And elements of a discourse are also mutually adjusted to each other. So I think there was, for instance, a certain discourse about women at the time. So they're more emotional, they're more sexual. That was a discourse about women at the time. So they're more likely to become witches. Yeah, so I would say that the discourse is sort of part of the environment that the concept of witchcraft was adapted to.
Okay, so what you could say is what you call culture is about the same as discourses. Isn't that true? I mean, these are very much overlapping concepts. I would say. Huh?
Technology is also a part of culture.
Of course.
Discourse is one element of culture. I would say.
All right. Okay, yeah. But in this case, very important.
Yeah, and in the case, if you want to look at certain beliefs about witchcraft, I think the discourse is a very important part of the context that you need to take into account.
Yeah, okay. Is there someone else who would like to comment or have questions? Jeroen, perhaps, or not? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Steije, for this presentation. I think we had a very interesting session here. Also, thank you, Jeroen, for that. And now we are, well, about in time, so we have now time for lunch and a break. Thank you very much.